Our firm works with a lot of hospice organizations, and it's now like budget planning season. And I get really excited about budget planning because it gives us the opportunity to think about our business in a different way and to run scenario based projections to look at, hey, if we did A, B, and C, what does it look like for our business? What I wanted to talk about today were budgeting related topics as it relates to hospice budget planning and how these things can impact and how we think about them in relation to our planning for the next fiscal year. The first topic is really understanding revenue sources. And so, in my experience working in hospice, a lot of organizations really try to dissect the revenue sources and try to predict how many days they are going to receive from each type of payer source. Now, in reality, at most, we're talking about a $20 per day swing in the different payer sources. And relatively speaking, they're all pretty close to each other. And I think there's a lot of time that is spent on trying to dissect those numbers when in reality, we just don't know predominantly where our payer sources are always going to come from. In most cases, obviously, we're going to be thinking about Medicare as our primary driver. That might be 70 to 80 or even 90% of our revenue. And the rest of the income is coming from Medicaid and private insurance companies. What we really should be doing is thinking about the aggregate average per day income that we're receiving from all of these sources together. And that's going to be the easiest way to project out what the revenue is going to be like for the remainder of the year. Now, certainly if you have a residence unit and you're thinking about private pay and the amount of patients that are coming through that are private pay for the room and board versus Medicaid, that's a bigger factor in the calculation. But when we're just thinking about home care services, it's really the easiest approach to just look at what's the aggregate average per day revenue that we're receiving for hospice home care services, and then project that as it relates to the number of days in the month throughout the year. Some months are going to have a little bit more revenue, some months are going to be a little bit less, but don't waste your time on dissecting the individual payer sources and trying to project out how many days Excelis is going to pay us versus how many days MVP is going to pay us. Not going to matter in the grand scheme of things. Look at the aggregate. The next thing that we think about a lot is really fixed versus variable costs. So when I'm preparing budgets for my hospice organizations, on the cost of goods side versus the pieces or the components that are going into patient care. So anything that touches a patient or goes into taking care of a patient would be a variable related cost. And specifically with your big ticket items, your DME, your oxygen, your drug costs, those you really want to project and budget on a per day cost. And that's going to help you in forecasting in the future. But if you look at it from a per day cost, you can really see the ups and downs as it relates to the number of patient days that you have, as opposed to projecting it out based on a static budget. We're going to spend $7 per day on DME, and we're going to average 1,000 billable days, and we're just going to put the static line item. If you look at those patient care, patient-related costs as the variable things that are going to go into your budget model, projecting out anything that touches a patient based on a cost per patient day, then it's going to help you to analyze how you're doing in the future. So when you look at your static budget, you might be a lower census than you've budgeted, and your costs are going to be below your static budget, but on a per day cost, you can analyze, hey, we're still spending a little bit more than we want to on a per day basis for our hospice patients. And so you've got to be looking at it from both perspectives. The static budget is not going to give you a good outline, but looking at it from a variable cost per day is where you want to land. Now, below the line, when you think about indirect related expenses, that's going to be more of your fixed related costs. Hey, what's my rent going to be every single month? What's my copier expense, my phone expense, my utilities? That is going to be where you're really going to be leaning into those fixed related costs. So really above the line, above your gross profit is really where you're going to be spending time analyzing variable costs. And then below the line is where you're going to be looking at your fixed related costs, those indirect expenses. Staffing and labor is the third component to this, and it relates to that variable spend per day. When you're looking at your staffing and labor costs, the first thing that I always do is try to analyze and try to back into what's reality with how many patients my nurses, my RNs, my social workers can see on a weekly basis, and then backing into how many nurses that and staff members we need based on the census that we currently have. Now, staffing has been a hugely important part of the puzzle right now, and there's definitely some qualitative factors that go into this staffing and labor cost plan, or more so than the quantitative. Hey, we know we're going to back into this many nurses. Right now, we're seeing a lot of vacancies in positions that are driving up overtime. We're also seeing a lot of turnover in a lot of those staffing positions, and that translate into additional train time, which leads to additional overtime. So when we're looking at labor cost of patient care, we've got to be mindful of some of those other components that are going to drive up the number of hours that we need to budget for. Again, I'm a big proponent of budgeting the hours in each discipline, so then you can analyze the actual number of hours by discipline in your payroll software, so you can see where we're falling out or where we're missing the boat. But that's, and in addition, when you look at your budget to actual numbers, you can also tie it into a percentage. So when you come up with the actual budget, you're going to say, hey, my RN spend is going to be 15% of my total revenue for the year. And as the year progresses, you can look at that total spend on a macro perspective and see, oh, revenue is lower or higher compared to where our plan was. And we can see that we're spending more or less on each individual line item for staffing, and we need to adjust accordingly. Then we can get more granular and look at the actual hours that are being spent. So if we have the same number of patients that we projected, the revenue is pretty close to where we want it to be, but our costs are higher. Now I can get granular, look at the hours that are being in that particular discipline to decide whether we need to make adjustments. On the indirect labor side, again, these are going to be more fixated. And so you've got to have a certain person in each bucket to be able to do things. You've got your finance, you've got your coffee, you've got your clinical supervisors, and those are going to be more fixated in nature. But the reality is, in hospice land, at this moment, we've got to be really thinking about how we can operate as lean as possible. One of the pieces to consider when we're going into next fiscal year is looking at everything that we're doing within each job description. And we got to ask ourselves, do we need to be doing that? Is the pieces or deliverables that are in each job description actually needed? And again, we need to be as lean as possible. And to be as lean as possible, we've got to be okay with letting something go that we really don't value that much, to open up time for that person to do other things to support the organization. Thinking about the number of patients that a biller can serve is really another high ticket item. We see organizations that are smaller in nature, but they have one biller that's running 30, 40, 50 patients. In my experience, a biller should be able to service somewhere around 100 patients per day. And so if we're running 50 patients per day, we really need a full-time biller. We've got to be open to the concept of either outsourcing that work or collectively working with another organization to share that billing service. Similar with QAPI services. Hey, do we really need a full-time person to do this, or can we share services? Shared services is a big thing that's happening right now in the hospice industry, so we can try to be as lean as possible. The reimbursement rate is not going up at the same pace as we're seeing other expenses, so thinking outside of the box and trying to be as creative as possible with some of those positions. Obviously, with your clinical supervision and your executive director role, that's something that's going to be more fixed in nature, but thinking about some of those other jobs that traditionally are fixed, but maybe we need to think about them holistically as they relate to, are they serving the greater population, or can we use them in other areas. Capital expenditure planning. This is a big piece of the puzzle as well. When we think about budget planning, obviously you're looking at the profit and loss that you're going to be projecting on a monthly basis. Now, the next piece of this layers in your cash flow planning and looking at the starting and ending balances of cash flow, excluding some of those non-cash items, your depreciation, amortization, and your accruals that you've got in that budget plan, to actually look at the cash spend on a monthly basis for your budget. In addition to that, now we need to layer in the capital expenditures that we want to realize in the year, and how are we going to be able to afford them. We can't always go into every capital expenditure thinking that we're going to be paying for it in cash, and thinking about maybe there's an opportunity to finance that cost, and how does that financing cost go into our cash flow projection. What a lot of organizations don't do is they don't take the next step in looking at that cash flow projection to see, if I need to put a roof on the building later in the year, where does that land in my calendar year? How does that roll into some of the other maybe fundraising events that we might have that might coincide with that cash outlay? And thinking about it from a cash perspective. Capital expenditure planning is a subcomponent of the whole budget. So we've got to be thinking about when that money is going to go out, when it's going to come in, and how it relates to your cash balances within the organization. Obviously, I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't talk about regulatory changes. So every year we see different changes in the industry, additional requirements. Historically, when Medicare changed the reimbursement to emphasize seeing patients in the last 7 days of life, we changed our model to think about, we need to see more patients. There's going to be more visits, more mileage that is going to occur throughout the year. And we need to plan for that in our budget. We also need to be thinking about, hey, the total reimbursement that we're going to realize. It's going to be an aggregate for 2024 of 2.9%. And okay, well, how does that obviously impact our revenues, and really timing our budget to show the increased revenue happening later in the year, in the fiscal year starting in October, laying the foundation for that, and layering in your other costs that are probably going to be going up higher than that 2.9 reimbursement that you're going to see. So looking at what is going to be reality, but then thinking about even below the line, what are your outside sources of revenue? Are you going to be changing your development? Are you going to be timing some of your fundraising events to coincide with dips in revenue? Are you going to be thinking about new fundraising opportunities? Fundraising is the next component, which I love thinking about because it is a hugely important area in nonprofit hospice, but one that doesn't get a whole lot of emphasis. The concept with development, which I love talking to clients about, is thinking about each fundraising event that you're doing and not only quantifying the hard costs that go into that fundraising event, but also the soft costs that go into it. A lot of us get sucked down the hole looking at a fundraiser that generates a big number on paper, but then when we factor in all the soft costs, which would be the time that our development people are spending preparing for it, and in coordination and everything that goes into planning that event, when you factor all of those components in, you may not be realizing the return on investment than you think you are. With our organizations, we always strive to make sure that we're realizing a 3 to 4x return on our investment. So for every dollar we spend, whether that's hard cost or soft cost, we want to be realizing 3 to 4x that return. And we don't do it if we're not going to realize that. The organizations, whether it's a not-for-profit hospice or just a regular not-for-profit, they want to do a bake sale as a fundraiser, don't even waste your time, because the amount of time that goes into it versus the outcome, dollars and resources that go into it, it's not even worth it. Organizations need to be thinking big picture fundraising events. And if it doesn't make the organization a minimum of $5,000 to $10,000, it's really not worth doing. On the flip side, you may think about still doing an event if it's a friend raiser event. I still think it's very important that organizations do something that helps to create awareness for the hospice. And fundraisers may not be a profitable endeavor, but they may have a social impact that would go beyond that dollar ROI. Contingency planning. I love budgeting for contingencies. So when we prepare a budget, we're always going to want to probably think about a side budget. So the beauty of how we do things is building a model in Excel that works with revenue sources, your payroll, your variable expenses, so you can tweak some of the numbers and everything kind of flows through correctly. But then also having a copy of that plan where you can adjust the number of patients or the census that you're going to realize. Maybe you've got an additional position that you're planning for, best and worst case scenarios, so that you can look at, hey, best case, this is what things might turn out to be. Worst case, this is what another outcome could be. And then your final budget is probably the most realistic, most agreed upon outcome. So contingency planning is very important in this whole model, and utilizing a budget planning template that can be adjusted very easily in different scenarios is going to be the most beneficial for hospice budget planning. Lastly, we'll talk about reporting and monitoring and how are we looking at this. So I mentioned earlier, thinking about your reporting in a static and also variable manner is going to be important. So there are people that just do a static budget and they just look at averages, and I don't think that that's going to justify anything. I think if you're not doing your due diligence. Now, there's other areas where you might think of MVI, multi-view type of model, where they just look at percentages and they actually don't do a budget. They decide on those percentages that they're going to spend in each area, whether it be direct, indirect, and other overhead, but they just decide this is what we're going to spend as a percentage. I think that that's missing the boat as well, because they don't look at some of the indirect and fixed items strategically enough. So I like to do it in both scenarios. I like to look at it from a static perspective and also a variable perspective, because it just opens the door to different ways to analyze your financials. Exactly how we report it in our financials to our clients, look at a static budget, but also look at a budget to actual variable percentage of revenue budget, so we can see how we're performing in every single area. So you got to look at it from a lot of different angles. I love budget planning as it relates to hospices. Like I said at the beginning, thinking about different possibilities for each organization is really what we need to be doing on a regular basis, making adjustments. Hospice is never going to be a very consistent linear path for anybody. It's a roller coaster up and down. Being nimble enough to make adjustments along the way is going to be incredibly important. And having a tool and a budget plan that you can fall back on to help you make projections is going to be what sets you apart from the other organization. Hope that helped. Have a great day.